So like Laura was saying, I am Anna Pederson. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm a doctoral student in counseling psychology. So this is my third year in the program. And I think I'm really excited to be here and sort of sharing this digital space with you all. And just getting a chance to really talk about the dissertation work that I'm kind of embarking on now and will be working on for the next couple of years. So this is going to be a qualitative study that I'm hoping to do that's going to be exploring how therapists make meaning of sex trade broadly, as well as how they respond to sex trading disclosures that clients make. So I'm still in the process of writing my proposal, and I think the tentative plan is to be able to be ready to defend sometime in February. So with that, this is very much a work in progress, which is part of why I'm really excited to be here, to be able to kind of talk with you all about what I'm doing, how I'm thinking, and then also get some feedback and just have time to sort of discuss this. If throughout this you have questions, yeah, feel free to drop them in the chat, or if I say something where you're like, if I miss this, I feel like I might not be able to follow moving forward, feel free to also just shout out any questions. But before I kind of dive into the study and my thinking about this work, I'll share with you a bit about who I am and what brought me to wanting to do this work over the next couple of years. And then after that, I'll kind of walk through, so how I got here, the purpose of the study, the significance I see for the work I want to do, some of the conceptual framework that I'll be using, the proposed methodology, and then we can have that time for questions, feedback, and discussion. So how did I get here wanting to study sex trade for years? So before I came to Madison, I lived in Memphis, Tennessee for about 10 years. And it was there back in 2016 that I really started this line of research. So at the time, I was earning my master's in counseling and really learning about the power that the therapeutic relationship between therapists and clients has, just broadly to be healing, I think most importantly, but then also to be really harmful as well. So at the time, I was also having my own sort of clinical experience as a counselor in training, which was really impactful. And it was also kind of in my early 20s when I was in this training that some very close friends of mine started doing sex work themselves. So I think some of them, were doing like acting in porn. Some were sort of working as sugar babies, so sort of informal escorts. And I was in this really cool class that was sort of on human sexuality and how to talk with clients about sex. And one of the things we had to do was take someone's personal sexual history. So I ended up asking one of these friends of mine who had been doing sex work if I could take their personal sexual history. And it was a really, I think, impactful experience because as this friend was sharing with me, they talked about a really challenging and traumatic experience they'd had with one client, which resulted in them experiencing a lot of elevated anxiety. And they were seeing a therapist at the time, but this was not something that they had disclosed to their therapist. So I think I realized then, like, one, there's a lot of valid reasons my friend might not want to share with their therapist that they had this really challenging experience in the context of what they identified as their work and sex work, anticipating blame, shame, judgment. And then myself, as someone who was seeing clients, I thought to myself, wow, I would be missing such a huge piece of really helpful information if my client had had this experience and didn't feel comfortable for really valid reasons to share this with me. And so I really wanted to start understanding, I think broadly, and then trying to figure out how I, as someone who, identifies as a researcher and practitioner, could make a difference. And so I was really lucky because at the University of Memphis, there was this really amazing research community that I was a part of. It was this constructivist sexuality lab that I was in during my master's. And so I had the support to really dive into figuring out how to engage in research. So I collaborated with a faculty member and a peer and did a Delphi study, which is mixed methods, exploring how, like, what sex workers or folks who identify as sex workers wanted therapists to have in terms of knowledge, skills, and attitudes. And so it was really cool. I was actually able to publish that my first year here in the PhD program. So that was really the start of this work. And I think since I've gotten here over the last 4 years, I think I've really come to find that a central pillar of the work I want to do is really decreasing disparities in the quality and accessibility of, I think, social services broadly, but especially mental health services. As someone who's like a psychologist in training, I think that's a place where I can have an impact. At the same time, I really love engaging in multidisciplinary spaces. So do at times think and want to engage in improving social services a bit more broadly. And improving them through being able to hopefully inform education and training for providers at very different levels of training. And I've gotten the chance to do that working with, for example, Lara Gerasi in the Department of Social Work, who's on my committee, doing work around understanding how medical providers find utility in like sex trafficking indicators. So I think this is a broad area of interest of mine. And yeah, that's why I'm sort of doing this for my dissertation. But so the purpose, I think really because I want to have an impact on the ability of folks who trade sex to be able to access affirming and inclusive services. I'm really interested here in focusing on mental health professionals, so I'm using that very broadly. So right now I'm thinking about folks who are psychologists, licensed, social workers, counselors. It's a pretty broad group. And seeing that, I think providers are a point of intervention. So being able to train providers to provide services can have an impact. And I think a lot of previous research has shown us that the attitudes, beliefs, biases, and experiences that therapists have when they come into their work with clients can have a really big impact on how they think about their work with clients and then how they choose to respond to them. And then this has implications for the therapeutic process. So things like that include the relationship, so the therapeutic alliance, which research has informed us has a really big relationship with clinical outcomes. And then that sort of relationship can also have a big impact on just folks' willingness to, one, access services and then stay engaged. So this is sort of how I made this just as I was like writing my literature review to try to organize this relationship I'm seeing, where there's all of these beliefs, attitudes, morals. I think morals are really salient, especially when we're talking about sex trade, because I think in the United States we have a lot of really, really strong values related to how we think folks should or should not engage in sexual behavior, broadly, especially when it comes to then sexual sort of commerce. So we see that there's this relationship between what a therapist comes in with, how they think about a client, how they treat a client. And this can have an impact on how folks think about diagnoses, how they think about treatment, and then again, that process and outcomes. And there has been prior work that has looked at this. So things, I think, going back to the 80s and earlier, especially around race, gender identity, and sexual orientation. And then a bit more recently, folks have looked at relationship orientation. And so what that means is essentially if folks identify as like polyamorous or non-monogamous, and how a client identifying as poly might impact the way a therapist thinks about and then treats a client. And so with my dissertation, I'm really hoping to like extend this work, this long line and lineage of research, to understanding how therapists work with individuals who trade sex across a continuum of agency to victimization, again, with the hope of being able to inform training and practice. But for a bit of context, I think it'd be helpful. There's a couple concepts and definitions that can provide that are informing just sort of how I'm thinking about this work. So I mentioned a continuum of agency. So this is something that Dr. Gerasi in social work and her colleague developed. So it's a continuum of agency to victimization. And this is, I think, sort of in terms of my positionality, how I think about sex trade. I use sex trade as an umbrella term really to encompass all that we see here. So when I talk about sex work, which I think is initially where I started off, especially in my master's, I think my focus was really only on sex work and sex workers. So these are folks who we can think about as like voluntarily choosing or consenting to engage in this work. At times it can be opting into doing sex trade within a context of constrained options and choices. But examples of what this might look like include just like full service sex work, so commercial sex, camming, exotic dancing. I think OnlyFans is now something we would lump in there. But yeah, sugaring, being a phone sex operator, acting in porn, things like that. And then in the middle, we see the commercial sexual exploitation. So this is when sex trade is occurring as a result of a vulnerability or a contextual factor being exploited. So this could look like factors such as homelessness, poverty, drug addiction, intellectual disability, things like that being exploited. And then we have the sex trafficking piece, which is, I think, in some ways like a little more clear cut in terms of having a very codified definition. So this is when someone who is an adult, so 18 years of age or older, is induced by force, fraud, or coercion to engage in a commercial sex act. And then this is also anytime someone who is a minor, so under the age of 18, engages in commercial sex. So it looks a bit clear cut, but there's also a lot of overlap, which I think is one of the things that makes, I don't know, this study really exciting to me, because I think it's, as a therapist, like a very complicated thing to understand how, you could be working with someone who's a minor engaging in commercial sex, and then they age out and they're 18 and deciding how do they identify, do they identify this work then as consensual? So I think it's a really complicated clinical consideration, but I really like the framing of this continuum because it recognizes that there is agency and there is victimization, and coercion can happen at any point along the spectrum, which I think, this is something that I talk with like undergrads who I'm a teaching assistant for. I gave a presentation on this and used the example of how, we can think about, I've been a barista in the past, and I think there were times when I was asked to stay late for a shift or to pick up an extra shift, and I didn't really feel like I actually had a choice. I don't really feel like I had the agency to say no to this person in a position of power over me. And so I think it helps also be able to kind of make, the idea of sex trade, which I think for me, in terms of my stance, I view as something that folks can engage in consensually, as something that we can look at as a form of labor. But so that is just a bit of context. So why does this matter? So for me, I think that a lot of my work has been done up until this point around the sort of sex worker side of things. And so really, I think a lot of research has sort of illustrated the ways that individuals who trade sex within the United States, they do face disparities in the quality and accessibility of mental health care services. So we could also add in there just, I think, most social services. So whether that's employment services, legal services, healthcare as well. I think that quite a bit of work has been done looking at just different barriers and facilitators to service access and engagement. So within that, a lot of work has kind of focused on the experiences of individuals who engage in street-based sex work, who might be multiply marginalized and face a lot, more systemic barriers, be at higher risk of experiencing physical and sexual violence, things like that. We also know from research that folks who trade sex in the United States experience significant social stigma, that there are these physical and mental health challenges that there can be a lot of social isolation that's experienced, and that there are also a lot of experiences of physical and sexual violence that may occur both within the context of work and then outside the context of folks' work. So I think, a very clear example of this is research that's been done around folks' willingness to sort of seek legal recourse or go to the police when they themselves, within the course of their, engaging in sex trade, experience violence or are threatened or robbed. And it's one, I think folks are hesitant to sort of go seek legal recourse, one out of fear for being charged because sex trade is criminalized broadly within the United States currently. And I think that there's a lot of examples where then law enforcement will actually sort of coercively require or ask for sexual services in order to, we'll just ask sex workers for sexual services in order to not be jailed when they've come forth with a crime. But so one of the ways that I think as I've been doing this work, I've come to understand these mental health and physical challenges, all of which I think are, again, amplified for folks with multiply marginalized identities, is the minority stress model. This, I think, can really explain a lot of those disparities that exist that sort of help justify why I think it's important that this study happens. So the first sort of pillar of the minority stress model is this experience of prejudice events. So these include discrimination, violence, I would say, just the criminalization and the impact of someone knowing that what they're doing for whatever purpose, whether it's something that they're forced to do, that they're doing just to make ends meet, or that they're opting into sort of out of the sense of feeling empowered and wanting to do this work, that it's criminalized and that they won't be able to seek recourse if something bad happens to them. The next core piece of this are expectations of rejection. And so I think that this is one of the places where I see that therapists can therapists and their response to clients can fit in, unfortunately. So a lot of times folks in expecting this rejection will conceal their identity. So they won't disclose that they trade sex in whatever capacity they do. This can result in a lot of hypervigilance, even though it's in a lot of ways a really adaptive coping mechanism to kind of conceal this part of self and this experience. But unfortunately, I think one of the things that we're learning from research is that actually when folks are able to disclose and have some sense of community, that can be a really positive coping mechanism. But I think that this expectation of rejection really fits nicely in with how we can understand why there is limited service access in engagement, or if folks do access services, why they might not choose to disclose that they trade sex. And the next piece of this is the internalized stigma piece. So this is when folks have incorporated into their self-concepts these negative attitudes and beliefs. And a lot of the literature, they talk about like whorephobia or whorephobic attitudes, and that kind of being the sex work stigma that is internalized by folks. Which for me, as someone who sees clients, when I'm like, oh, anytime I see folks who have like a stigmatized identity, it seems like a really helpful place to intervene around therapeutically, to provide like a new experience of someone's identity or experience being affirmed and understood and validated. So again, I think this is why it's really, strong motivator for me to do this work. And I think sort of housing this within the minority stress model, and I think more specifically, I've been drawing from the sexual minority stress model, since that writing has really been around, minority stress for folks whose sexual behavior is stigmatized, which I think sex trade can fit broadly within that. But the minority stress model also then points us to these sort of provider level interventions, which are great. So therapists, need to be able to examine their assumptions, their biases. They can acquire education and training, and then talk with folks and assess clients for the presence or absence of minority stress. And they can offer affirming and inclusive services. So I think one of the challenges with this is in some ways like a lot of lack of education or training And I think that's one of the main motivators for wanting to do the study I did during my master's. I think I looked in the literature for sort of best practices around working with folks who trade sex and didn't really find much. I think that there are organizations around the country who, there's some that are like by and for sex workers who have put out some really helpful information for providers. And then there are also organizations that are really focused on sex trafficking and supporting providers and working with survivors and folks with that lived experience. But there's not a lot out there, or at least not in terms of the way we kind of see within psychology, at least how there have been best practice guidelines developed, for example, for working with folks who are trans or just identify as queer, or any of those sort of really helpful, structured, well-researched guidelines that can, be referenced to sort of ensure quality services are provided. Let's see. So as I've been doing this work, I think because it's qualitative, the conceptual framework is really where I've been spending the bulk of my time, trying to figure out sort of how I'm thinking about this work, what are the questions I'm wanting to ask. I think a big challenge that I am still kind of in the process of mucking through is reminding myself that the focus is on therapists. I think because the work I've been doing has been focused on this, sex workers, and my real strong desire is to improve services for folks in that community. That's where a lot of my time has been spent. That's where a lot of the literature I was mostly embedded in was and continues to be. And so I think I've been in this very iterative process of figuring out like what all is out there, what can I draw on really to ground this qualitative work in, which I think a big challenge is actually that a lot of the research around this is really siloed. So usually there's work that focuses on sex workers, there's work that focuses on sex trading and sex trafficking, and less that kind of bridges that gap, which is really one of the things I'm hoping to do. And so there are a couple dominant perspectives that Nichols has written about in their work. And my hope really is to hold these in mind as I sort of analyze the perspectives of the participants who I work with. So really looking at how they articulate their conceptualization of sex trade, and seeing how those do, whether or how those map onto these frameworks and perspectives, in addition to really utilizing open and emergent data analysis strategies to also find sort of alternative ways to understand what folks end up sharing with me. But so there are some, thankfully, dominant perspectives, and these are just a couple. There's some others that I won't touch on today, but one of them is a sort of liberal feminist perspective. I think within these feminist perspectives broadly, there is an emphasis on eradicating gender inequality. The liberal feminist perspective, as written about by Nichols, really focuses on the experiences of women in sex trade. So here, agency is something that is defined as one being able to participate in sexual labor and having that option. Victimization is understood as something, anytime that choice or agency of an individual isn't impinged on or denied. The liberal feminist perspective is one that holds that sex work is something that folks can engage in a way that's empowering and in a way that can be healing, at the same time as acknowledging, while maybe not necessarily centering, the experiences of victimization that can and do occur within sex trade. I think before I go further, I'll say all of these perspectives condone or condemn, not condone, sex trafficking. So I think that is shared among all of these. And I think within them, though, there are pretty big differences in terms of how they center agency, victimization, the role of the state in regulating or not regulating sexual commerce, and sort of where they fall on the criminalization or decriminalization of sex trade broadly. And then the radical feminist perspective is one that focuses on women's common experience. So it holds the stance that there are shared experiences among women across the board. This perspective really views sex trade as victimization hard stop. It is conceived as sort of the subjugation of women to men. Women are conceptualized as sexual objects. And I think something that is really central here is that there's a perspective that agency is denied to all women societally when sexual commerce is able to happen, because it's viewed as the way folks in sex trade are treated really is reflective of how women are able to be treated within society at large. Something here too is the perspective that sex work and sex trafficking are indistinct. These are all forms of victimization. And I think that this is one of the sort of more dominant perspectives in some of the literature that's been written about sex trade. I think the sort of liberal feminist perspective is a bit newer. But again, I think what I've found over the years is that there's usually very little overlap between those. And then we also have the intersectional feminist perspective. So this one rejects the notion that there is a singular experience among women. It also holds that there is a lot of gender diversity within sex trade, which is reflected in the literature. Since even though I think it is something that folks who identify as women are probably the dominant folks who engage in sex trade. Globally, we also do know that there are a lot of folks who are trans who are involved in sex work, and that those folks in particular face disproportionate risk of violence and victimization. And yeah, and there's also, I think holds that men engage in sex work, which I think we know to be true. And I think importantly, the intersectional feminist perspective really is interested in the ways that the different, intersecting identities someone holds and the different privileges and oppressions they hold impact someone's pretty holistic experience potentially in sex trade. So how they enter into the work, whether it's through force, whether it's through context of constrained options, or then sort of what experiences they have within sex trade. I think there's some really cool work that's been done that really shows the ways that systems of oppression, so racism, show up within sex work. And then folks' experiences and ability to exit sex trade, I think, are also impacted by these as well. So this perspective holds also that really the decision to advocate for the abolition of sex trade can in some ways be removing a really essential survival mechanism for folks without opting in to offer sort of an alternative, which privileges folks who I think are predominantly white and cis, who would have access to means of exiting. But so these are just a couple of their perspectives. There's political perspectives as well that sort of look more at the role of the state. So there's a neoliberal perspective that sort of argues that really the state should not regulate sexual commerce at all. And there's the abolitionist perspective that really argues that sexual commerce is sort of sexual slavery, that the state should abolish all of this. So there is overlap between some of the political perspectives and the feminist perspectives, but there's also differences there as well. But so my hope with these is really, or my hunch is that these perspectives will align with the perspective shared by providers as they articulate what sex trade means to them. And it'll kind of inform how they think about sex trade when they're working with their clients. And hopefully there will be new things that emerge as well, which would be super exciting. But that sort of just brings me to my methodology that I'm planning on using. So in this work, I'm hoping to use a basic qualitative approach where I'll really explore just sort of how people are interpreting their experience, how they construct their world, and the meaning they attribute to their experience. And so wanting to use interviews over the phone and video, which I think I would do even if we were not in the midst of a pandemic, just to kind of have a broader reach. the folks who I am intending to sample are broadly mental health professionals with experience working with clients who traded sex, residing within the United States. I'd say that this is one of the pieces that I am struggling with currently in terms of figuring out, I think, how I will, like what my inclusion and exclusion criteria will be, since I think there are providers out there who market themselves as working with sex workers, being affirming of sex workers. I think that's a really important voice on sort of one end of a continuum. And then I think that there are also providers out there who specialize in working with survivors of sex trafficking. And that's sort of like another pole, I think, that exists. So I imagine I will sort of intentionally try to reach out to and sample from those groups. And I think I'm genuinely curious about, folks who maybe don't have that specialization or training, but maybe have worked with someone who traded sex, like how do they also think about sex trade? And how did they respond when their client shared with them that that's something they do? And so I think that this is part of like the work in progress piece of this, where I think I'm still sorting through like how to get the information I want with my sample. But I think this is sort of, what I've alluded to. I think my primary research questions are really how do mental health professionals make meaning of sex trade, and then how do they respond to sex trading disclosures? And I think embedded within that is an interest in understanding like how do you conceptualize, or how does someone trading sex fit into your conceptualization of a client? So, when we think of conceptualization, it's like how does distress arise? How is it maintained, and how do we intervene to make change? And then thinking about clinical decision making, diagnosis, treatment, and then I don't know, just how therapists think about the relationship with the client. And embedded within that is an interest in whether or how biases influence the work with clients who trade sex. So I think the next piece I have, yes, and the aim is to inform training practice. I think I'm like short on time, but I've run shorter than I anticipated. The next piece I have is actually just questions and discussion. So that was shorter than I expected. But that's where we are. Thank you all for listening. Laura, should I unshare?
Yeah, feel free to unshare, and we can, if people want to turn on their cameras to ask questions, feel free to do that. Also, definitely feel welcome to ask questions in the chat. Yeah. Thank you so much. I've learned so much in this period of time that about topics and theories and frameworks that I think are really interesting. So I appreciate that for sure.
Yeah, thank you. And I think I don't know, if there are parts that feel unclear or things that folks would be more interested in learning, or just, I think as a work in progress, I'm very, very curious about, what stood out to folks. Oh, there's a chat going.
Hi, can we go ahead and ask questions? Sorry, I didn't catch that. Hi, thank you. Thanks, Anna, for your presentation. I am also a graduate student, so I was really interested in your methodology. I mean, that was why I got, actually, that was why I joined, and I'm excited for the work you do. And I was very curious, like when you mentioned about like your sampling, if maybe snowball sampling might be like helpful for you is identifying the sex workers and having them like help you recruit their own providers, since it sounds like you might have more access to that population. And then secondly, I've never heard of basic qualitative method actually, so I looked it up, and then it's like a combination of phenomenology and all of that. I feel like in maybe future presentations for like, it might be helpful to maybe expand on that, so that I feel like the word basic is because of just how it's used in this generation. It sounds like I'm just basically doing, but it sounds like it's a really strong, well, like grounded word. So, so I really appreciate learning about that. And so thanks for presenting. I think those were like my 2 comments.
That's super helpful. I actually, yeah, I hadn't even thought about sampling through reaching out to folks who are sex workers and asking them about their therapist. So that is very helpful. I'm like taking notes. And yeah, I think the basic qualitative approach is actually not one that I was familiar with before starting the dissertation process. But my academic advisor, Travis Wright in counseling psych, is a qualitative researcher. And I think as we've talked through this work, I think we talked about whether like grounded theory or like more of a purely phenomenological approach would make sense. But I think he encouraged me to use, and I would agree, like I think when he said basic qualitative approach the first time, I had, I think, the same reaction of like, what is that? Like, why is it basic? And so I think I definitely, yeah, had that same reaction. But so that's a really, really helpful point to kind of just expand on that a bit more, because yeah, it would make sense that people had the same reaction I did.
Hey, and I think this is really exciting work. Thanks for sharing it. I'm curious about why you aren't thinking about interviewing providers who haven't had sex workers disclose, because I would be really curious to know what it is about them that is making their clients not feel comfortable if they've had them. And I think I like that idea of recruiting through people who trade sex and have seen a therapist, to also get that perspective of like, I trade sex, I see a therapist, I haven't disclosed, and then talk to that therapist.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So my roommate is in my program, and we've been talking about just the proposal, and I think she brought up the same question. And I think there's a couple reasons why currently I am not planning on talking with folks who don't know that they've had a client who has traded sex. You know, I think, well, one of those is just that I think I've been trying to keep the focus of the dissertation contained, not only to ensure that I can get it done, but also since I think this line of work and research is one that I anticipate kind of like carrying through within my sort of career trajectory. And so I think I'm trying to hold like I could do multiple studies, and like I just have to do this one right now. And so yeah, and I guess I think yeah, I'll have to think more about if I was to recruit folks through those who've traded sex, because I think it does get complicated just in terms of like finding those people, having them be willing to disclose that they've seen a therapist, disclosing who their therapist is. Yeah, so I think that's something that I would definitely like need to consult my committee about, just to see how they sort of think about that. Since I think one of the reasons that it seems helpful, I think, for the dissertation purpose to sample providers is because they're not a vulnerable population. And when I interviewed sex workers in the past, there was a lot more that I had to do just to protect folks' identities, because they're doing something that's criminalized, and I'm asking them to disclose something that is illegal that they've participated in. But yeah, no, that's a great question. Thank you.
Yeah, it would definitely add many more layers to recruitment. I'm also curious if you could talk a bit about how you think about religion, the provider's religion, and the intersections with their beliefs, and like how much they should set aside their own beliefs in the therapeutic relationship.
Yes. So I imagine, well, I think because morals sort of just impact a lot of how we think about things, I imagine that folks' religiosity, religious morals and values will would impact sort of like how they think about sex trade. So like, I think in some ways, the sort of radical feminist perspective that views this all as like victimization, in some ways aligns more with this sort of like conservative framework, or like conservative ideological framework. And so I do think that there is an overlap there, and just an overlap and not a full alignment. I mean, I guess in my training, my personal training as like a psychologist in training, I think we're often taught to be aware of those like values, norms, beliefs, morals that we hold. Just so we're aware of like how they do influence, whether or how they influence our perception of clients. And I think there are identities and there are experiences that being trained as like multiculturally competent providers we get, and this isn't part of it. So we're kind of given the experience of learning like how do we think about and talk about race, how do we think and talk about class, and I think those are areas that like as lifelong learners we need to like continuously be mindful of and seek training and education around. But I think like occupation for folks who view sex work as their occupation isn't something we learn about. And so, you know, if like a client discloses that they're a sex worker and this is something a therapist never thought of, I feel like they'd be like, whoa, what do I think about this? How do I think about this? I don't know. And you kind of have to do that on the fly, whereas I think there's a lot of other things that we get in our training that kind of prime us to think about like and be prepared for and understand where we are. I don't know if that answers your question.
It does. Thank you for yeah, thank you.
And another thought, I mean, I think that in the interviews, like as people, you know, talk about how they make meaning of sex trade and like what informs those beliefs, like I imagine that religion and religious values and morals would be something that we kind of like get down into. Yeah.
I'm also really curious, Anna, about maybe there are studies out there already, but about like sex work now, like their perspectives of like the sex workers and how that might impact like their mental health or things like that. As you said, like I don't know, I've also seen like a lot of that within my peers, like with platforms like OnlyFans. I don't know if you know places like that where it's like more commonplace now, and like sugarbaby.com and things like that. And I'm really like, I didn't have time to look it up, but I was really curious, like while you were gathering this information, if that kind of informed why you wanted to really look at the mental health aspect.
I don't know how much research has been done about that. That's a good question. I think because I don't have a clear answer, I'm like, I don't think it's explicitly framed sort of my motivation, but I think it's, you know, I don't know, but I think there is work that has looked at, I think when folks look at that sort of like internalized stigma, I think there are dynamics that have been written about where folks who trade sex, like there's like a hierarchy where there's the folks who are like sugar babies or like escorts who I think judge folks who do like straight-based sex work. And I think there's a lot of racial dynamics that come into play there as well, and class dynamics. So I think in that sense, like the way that internalized sex work stigma manifests within folks who trade sex to kind of inform these judgments within and about other folks who trade sex, I think that's out there. And yeah, I think.
Yeah.
Yes. This is great. This is very thought-provoking. I love it.
I have a question because I don't really know the background of like counseling psychology or like how you would apply the findings, but how, if you would like, how your goal or your dream scenario of how your research findings would be used, utilized, and impact the field, what would that look like?
Yeah, well, so I think counseling psychology, one of the things that drew me to this sort of subspecialty in psych is just like the emphasis on like social justice and equity, and really not just being researchers who just publish, but also having an impact on service provision and communities. So I think that the development of like best practices and like trainings is sort of where I would like to go. And I think that's, yeah, I think for mental health care providers and for social service providers more broadly, whether that's, you know, I think like I'm in a consultation class currently, and next week I'm giving a talk to providers in like northeastern Wisconsin who work with youth at risk of sex trafficking about how to provide affirming and inclusive services to LGBTQ plus youth. So I think being able to do that sort of thing, but more broadly to folks about like how do you work in affirming and inclusive ways with folks who trade sex, and like what does that look like within these sort of subpopulations. I think that is what I would like to do when I grow up, basically. Any other thoughts, questions, reactions?
I don't know if you want to pop your email into the chat, Anna,
Yeah.
in case folks are interested in contacting Anna later with any questions or comments. I feel like this is definitely such new content for me that it's going to take a while to process and think about all the different components of what you unpacked for us today. But I really appreciated it.
Yeah. Thank you all for your time and sharing digital space.
Like this would be the time where we, in reality, would all be clapping, but it's virtual
Yeah.
claps today.